My name is Jordi Cruyff. I would like to explain my younger years and the progress of starting as a youth player in Barcelona and then growing to be an older veteran player and adapting myself to different positions. So in Barcelona, as you all know, already from the youth, the target is very clear. Be comfortable on the ball. The build-up starts with the goalkeeper. The pressure starts with the striker. So in the end, we learn in all different phases what is expected from you in every different position. I started my Barcelona career at the age of like 13, 14. And my position was normally or attacking midfielder or playing one of the three positions up front. Depending on the system, if we play a 4-3-3, I would be this player. But I always had like a drive to always get in the box. I also played a lot of times as a striker, but always with players near me that when I would come in the ball, they would make the run. I would attract central defenders, they would run behind me. So always one of these would actually be a very, very attacking player. When I got a little bit older, I touched already the first team of Barcelona. A lot of people always talk about the 4-3-3 of my father, but a lot of people forget that it wasn't always 4-3-3. It was also a long period of time in which the system was actually kind of this. Was 3 at the back, which a lot of times, if my father played against 2 strikers, he didn't want 4 defenders at the back. He didn't want to have 2 extra players here because he would feel that he's missing 2 extra players in other places of the pitch. So imagine the lineup. If you have Ferrer, who's man marker, he's aggressive, he's small, but he's fast, good on the ball. He could run. He was fast to cover all spaces behind the defense. On this side, a lot of times was Sergi Barjuan, who's similar to Ferrer, but also disciplined, could have the speed to sprint 5 meters and could immediately close gaps. That's what my father wanted because he knew that when we were attacking, there would be a lot of space behind the defense. So he needed some kind of speed. Then he always wanted an organizer, which was Ronald Koeman, very good on the ball, of course, but also a player who understood how to organize, who did not want to be exposed against a very fast striker. So he would always have these players kind of near him to make sure that always there was a 3 against 2. That if the strikers would be here, for example, strikers would be here, then Sergi would come a little bit over here. If the strikers were there, then he would come here. Always to try to create a 3 against 2 situation at the back. And this player, this was obviously the key player, was Guardiola. Now, Guardiola was not a central defender. Sometimes he would end up there if the opponent would have an attack, but normally his position in the build-up would be here. And you would see here kind of a diamond in the midfield. And of course, the goalkeeper always had to be a player who didn't stay on his line, but was always here, ready to receive the ball and build up, to play. But also, if there's a lot of space and the defensive line is pushed up, that he wouldn't stay here, but he would come here. Just to make sure that if there's a long ball from the opponent, that he would be kind of a libero to help his defense, so we could push up as a team a lot more. Now, a lot of times, Guardiola would be here. He was a master of angles. He was very good in playing in 2 touches, control with the lift, passing, and trying to find players between the lines. He always had a vertical pass. And of course, as you know, Koeman had an amazing, pass over 60, 70 meters. He could just put it right on your chest. So that was the power, but especially I think it was the angle game between them, that when a striker would put pressure, Guardiola immediately knew that here was the space. He would receive the ball here or here. So I think if you look at this lineup, it's a lineup purely based on football possession and not thinking at all in how we defend. My father pushed a lot that when we would lose the ball in attack, we had to make immediate pressure because he wanted to recover the ball as high as possible and also to help them that they didn't end up only defending. He wanted them to have the ball and to be the creators of the game. And if we didn't do our job here well, we would make them kind of suffer a lot more because we would put them against strikers of opponents who are maybe fast and tall, and this was not always our strength. In the midfield, he always had one player who could be kind of a box-to-box, who could be arriving, but also could play here to help. And one player who was very good in build-up. Because if the opponents, they would put one player on Guardiola, which after a while they would do, because they knew he was the key in the build-up with the angles, then a lot of times Eusebio would play here, who was also a very good football player, understanding angles. So he would just attract, then Eusebio would come here, and the build-up would go through this player. Or a lot of times he would just come inside, Eusebio would come here, and Eusebio would receive and make sure the build-up was well organized. In attack, my father was, I think, one of the first coaches who actually not always had a pure number 9. It's true that there was a time, of course, it was Romario, who was a pure number 9, but there was also a time that it was without him. And then he used to look for example, put Laudrup, who is not a pure number 9. He would play as a striker. He would have Baquero here. And then, of course, he would use Koeman's strength, both sides. He would have Stein here sometimes. Stoichkov there, as you know, very fast player. So the idea would be that Laudrup would come in the ball. He would attract the central defenders. And then, of course, Stoichkov's strong point was to run behind. Koeman had an amazing pass. So a lot of times we saw this pass here, that Laudrup would attract, would come. Baquero would make a run this side to open him. And of course, Stoichkov would make that run. Koeman had an amazing pass, and this happened so many times that I think that was also one of our trademarks of the team. My father was not so obsessed with players always staying in one position. He really liked movements. As long as the positions were occupied by someone, he was already quite happy. But he liked players who would be able to mix around, to be like this for a while, or to be like that for a while, or to be like that for a while. He always tried to find those kind of players. When Romario was here, of course, Romario is not a player who should be playing in the wing. He was really a goal hunter in the box. So yes, then of course these three were the ones who would be able to change positions and try to just by movements confuse the opponents in the best possible way. Another aspect of my father, which went through a lot of things, not only in football. My father was obsessed with angles and with triangles. So he always felt that in football, the more triangles you have, the more options to play you have. And he would prefer in different lines. He would not like this, for example. Because if you lose the ball, you lose 3 players with one loss. He would always want players to play in different lines. So Koeman would be slightly behind him. He would have these 2 players. Guardiola was alone in this line. Then you would have 2 players in this line with him coming whenever necessary. You would have also the direct pass. Normally it was Baquero. Baquero was very good at receiving the ball with his back to the goal. And then lay it off to one of these 3 players. And then we would already be one line further. And we still had the ball possession with enough players in good positions, in good rest defense, that when we would lose the ball, we would be well organized to prevent counterattacks. And also here, he always had everywhere different triangles. And my father, all his trainings every day would be possession games, 4 against 4 with 3 jokers, all had to do with finding the triangles on the pitch. And, he could be very insisting sometimes, but in the end, in the matches, I think you could see the results of what he was looking for. Also games when it was the opponent would play a different system. It's true that sometimes he would play like this, but in the build-up he would want him to dribble out and join the midfield, to occupy the space. Sometimes it would also be like this. Of course, if this would happen, then you would have a little bit more this kind of situation, that he would come in the ball, he would come in the ball, he would come in the ball, but never the 3. This he never wanted. He always wanted some players to play between the lines of the opponent and try to create always angles like we see on this board.